everybody. How are you? Well, one of my favorite books to read when I taught first grade was Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. And so I'm going to read it to you. There aren't some pictures. I'm just going to read a couple of pages. And what I like to always do with my class, I would have them take a piece of paper, and while I read, they would draw. And then we would see if the pictures kind of summed up what I had read about. So when I finish reading this, I'm going to show you a picture that I drew of the first couple of pages. If you want to go grab a piece of paper and a pencil, or if you have one in front of you, while I'm reading, you could try drawing what I'm reading about. So anyway, that's something you could do, and I'm going to read a couple of chapters for the next few days of Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. It's really a fun and funny book. So here we go, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. And it's written by Betty McDonald. I expect I might as well begin by telling you about Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, so that whenever I mention her name, which I do very often in this book, you will not interrupt and ask, who is Mrs. Piggle Wiggle? What does she look like? How big is she? How old is she? What color is her hair? Is her hair long? Does she wear high heels? Does she have any children? Is there a Mr. Piggle Wiggle? Mrs. Piggle Wiggle lives here in our town. She is very small, and she has a hump on her back. When children asked her about the hump, she says, "Oh, that's a big lump of magic. Sometimes it turns me into a witch, and other times into a dwarf or a fairy, and on special occasions it makes me into a queen." The children are all very envious of the hump, because besides being magic, it is such a convenient place for wings. Now, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle has brown, sparkly eyes and brown hair, which she keeps very, very long, almost to her knees, so the children can comb it. She usually wears it on top of her head in a knot, unless someone has been combing it, and then she has braids or long, wet curls. And her hair just hangs, and she sometimes puts on a jeweled crown or flowers on top. One day I saw her digging in the garden wearing the jeweled crown, and with her hair billowing down her back. She waved gaily and said, "I promised Betsy," Betsy is one of her children friends, "that I would not touch this hair until she came home from school." And she just went on with her digging. Mrs. Piggle Wiggle's skin is a goldy brown, and she has a warm, spicy, sugary cookie smell that is very comforting to children who are sad about something. Her clothes are all brown, and they never look crisp, or they don't look pressed because they are used for dress-up. She wears felt hats, which the children poke, and sometimes they twist into witches or pirates' hats. And you know what? Mrs. Piggle Wiggle does not mind at all. Sunday morning, she takes one of the hats off the closet shelf. She gives it a few thumps, pulls it firmly down, and wears it to church. She wears high heels all the time and is glad to let the little girls borrow her shoes. Mrs. Piggle Wiggle has no family at all. She says that her husband, Mr. Piggle Wiggle, was a pirate, and after he had buried all of his treasure in the backyard, he died. She just has herself and Wag, her dog, and Lightfoot, her cat. The most remarkable thing about Mrs. Piggle Wiggle is her house. Do you know how her house is built? Upside down. It's a little brown house. And sitting there in its tangly garden, it looks like a small brown puppy lying on its back with its feet in the air. Mrs. Piggle Wiggle says that when she was a little girl, she used to lie in bed and gaze up at the ceiling and wonder and wonder and wonder what it would be like if the house were upside down. Have you ever done that? I have. And so when she grew up, she built her house upside down just to see what it was like. The bathroom, the kitchen, and the staircase are right side up. They are more convenient that way. You can easily see that she could not cook on a stove that was upside down, or wash dishes in an upside down sink, or walk up upside down stairs. In the living room of her house is a large chandelier, and instead of being on the ceiling, it's on the floor. Of course, it is really on the ceiling, but the ceiling is the floor. And so it is on the floor, and the children turn on the lights, and then they squat around it pretending it's a campfire. Mrs. Piggle Wiggle says that her chandelier is the only one in town which is put to any real use. Her bedrooms all have slidey boards in them, because if you will look up at your attic ceiling, you'll see that a slanty ceiling, when turned upside down, makes a fine slidey board. Whee! Also, all the wall lights are very close to the floor and handy for small children. For the first 5 or 10 years after the house was built, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle climbed in and out of her rooms over the high doorways, but now she has small steps which are just the thing to practice jumping. She gives the children chalk so they can mark on the rug how far they jumped. Nobody knows how old Mrs. Piggle Wiggle is. She says she doesn't know herself. She says, "What difference does it make how old I am, when I shall never grow any bigger?" Mrs. Piggle Wiggle's dog Wag has puppies every once in a while, and so she keeps a long list of the names of children who want them. It's on her blackboard in her kitchen. For Lightfoot the cat's kitten, she has a long waiting list on the blackboard in the dining room. Now, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle's backyard is full of big holes. The boys dig for Mr. Piggle Wiggle's buried treasure. And her front yard is full of flowers, which the little girls pick. They jam into vases and place all about her living room to carry to their teachers. Every single child in town is a friend of Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. But she knows very few of their parents. She says grown-ups make her nervous. For the first year after she built her house, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle lived there all by herself, except for Wag and Lightfoot, and she was very lonely. Then one dark rainy afternoon, when she was baking sugar cookies and thinking how much fun it would be if she knew someone besides Wag and Lightfoot to invite for tea, she looked out her window, and there, coming up the street in the pouring rain, dragging a big suitcase and bawling, do you know what bawling means? Crying, was a little girl. Mrs. Piggle Wiggle wiped the flour off her hands and hurried right out into the rain and invited this little girl in for tea. Now tomorrow we're going to find out what that little girl's name is and what happens with that little girl. But I want to show you the picture that I drew after reading. I reread those pages. I hadn't read them in years. And before I read the story to you, I wanted to draw a picture of what I think that happened in that story so far. So there is Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. See her hair? It goes down to her knees. She's in a brown dress. And sometimes she wears a jeweled crown. And there is her upside down house. Wow, there's some beautiful flowers for the girls to pick. And there's some holes where the boys have dug for buried treasure. And do you see Wag and Lightfoot? Yes, they've been her great companions. So this is Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, and I don't know if you drew a picture, but if you drew a picture, you could keep it. And then tomorrow when I read some more, you could draw another picture of what I'm reading about. So that might be fun, and you'll have your own book of Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. Because you know what? When I look in this book and I go to read it, look at, it's just lots of words. Lots of words and just very, very few pictures. So I like to imagine as I'm reading, and that's what I imagined that Mrs. Piggle Wiggle looked like. Now, most of the time she wore her hair up on top of her head, but she would often wear it down so the little girls and the kids could play and brush it. And I just love her upside down house. Don't you love that? Wouldn't that be fun to slide down the slidey boards? Oh my goodness. The next story I'm going to read today is called George Washington's Teeth. Papa thought that I should read another book about history, so I decided to read a little bit about George Washington. It says, all of his life, George Washington had problems with his teeth and worked hard to save them. This story is based on what really happened to George and his teeth. The Revolutionary War, George hoped would soon be won, but another battle with his teeth had only just begun. George Washington rushed into town. The dentist heard his shout. "Hold still," he said, then gave a yank. A rotten tooth popped out. Poor George, he didn't have good teeth. All that night George tossed and moaned. Another tooth was sore. But at the dawn he saddled up and he galloped off to war. He didn't have time to worry about his teeth. George reached New York as British ships invaded every port. Preparing for a fierce attack, his soldiers built a fort. He sure was brave. Inside he rubbed his swollen gums with soothing oil of myrrh until a sentinel cried out, "Here come the British, sir!" Charging on the field, George thought, "There's something in my mouth." He spat into his handkerchief. Another tooth came out. "This can't be happening," George gasped. "What if someone should see? If word got out I'm losing teeth, my men would laugh at me." While no one looked, he wrote a note his dentist would receive. "Please come," it said. "I'll need your help when I get home on leave." So wow, George was fighting a battle and then losing his teeth. Back at home, George lost more teeth till he had only 10. "Oh, Martha dear," George cried, "I fear I'll never eat again." She fed him mush and pickled tripe, but when guests came to dine, he sneaked one of his favorite nuts. Uh-oh, then he had only 9. Another tooth came out. George crossed the icy Delaware with 9 teeth in his mouth. In that cold and pitchy dark, guess what? 2 more teeth came out. Snow fell on George at Valley Forge. His blue coat hung in tatters. By then he'd only 7 teeth that couldn't even chatter. Yet bravely George led forth his men, coat and pigtail flying. While cannons boomed, he held his jaw and groaned, "I think I'm dying." Wow, he must have been in pain. The redcoats fled. George won the war. When he returned alive, Martha checked for 7 teeth, but counted only 5. He just had 5 teeth left. He hid the evening of her ball, ashamed his friends would see. That night the dentist came again, and George lost another 3. Poor George had 2 teeth in his mouth. The day the votes came in, the people had a president, but one who was afraid to grin. A portrait artist came to George. He said, "I know a trick. I'll pad your mouth with cotton balls to puff your sunken lips." George stood up to have a look. He fell back on his fanny. "It doesn't look like me," he roared. "It looks like Martha's granny." He yanked the cotton from his mouth, then gasped, "What have I done?" The cotton held a rotten tooth. Now George had only 1. Just 1 tooth left. George still had that tooth the night a knock came at the door. "I've brought false teeth," the dentist called. "Teeth that won't get sore." George put them in, but when he smiled, springs snapped against his tongue. Out flew those teeth. "Ah!" George shrieked. "They've knocked out my last one." Oh, dear. "Oh, no," George moaned. "I'm toothless." He kept his mouth shut tight. He couldn't sleep. He paced the floor and prayed with all his might. "If only I had teeth," thought George. He pondered what to do. "Aha," he cried. "All my old teeth might help make something new." He searched Mount Vernon's bedchambers, the pantry, parlors, and halls, through shelves, desk drawers, and the musty floor of every horse's stall. George found no teeth. Alas, they're gone. A great sob shook his shoulders. Through tears he peered in one last chest, leaped up and yelled, "My molars!" With plaster and those teeth he found, George poured a simple mold that showed the dentist how to make false teeth George hoped would hold. The dentist took strong hippo tusk and carved a set to size, each tooth secured with screws of gold that lit up George's eyes. Wow. Can you guess the story's end? Those new teeth fit just right. And around the ballroom with his friends, George danced through all the night. And this is the timeline, a real timeline that tells some of the actual things about George losing his teeth. So they kind of made it be a fun story, but some of this actually happened to George Washington. And back then, they didn't have all the dental help that we have nowadays. So I'm going to say good night, and I love you all. Bye.
Amen.